Bound for Oregon, Chapter 2. Mary Ellen, Father called. Bring me my saw, please, and take that small bucket to get some water. I hurried off to the well, but the minute I set down the brimming water bucket, I heard Mother's voice. Mary Ellen, she called, will you finish the churning while I get my soap to boiling? We'll need to take a lot of soap, you know. I had to be done to prepare for our journey. All winter long I seemed to race from one chore to another, churning the butter, minding the baby, washing dishes, helping spin and card all the balls of soft wool that Mother wanted to take along. I hardly had any time for my lessons, or for memorizing my favorite poems by Robert Burns. Of course, Lavinia helped too. She was 6 years old now and could bring in the potatoes from the root cellar and sticks of wood for kindling, and she was good at helping me watch little Cynthia. All the time I was doing my chores, my mind buzzed with thoughts about leaving things behind. Our comfortable house, Mother's rose bushes that she loved so much, even Father's pottery wheel, which would not fit into our wagon, he said. About school, which I might never be able to go to again once we left Arkansas, and about Grandma, especially Grandma. When I first told her about Oregon, stopping by her house on my way to school, Grandma had laid aside the new quilt her busy fingers were stitching on. She pulled me down into her lap, smiling. Grandma's smile was like sunshine. I knew your pa would come to this, she said. I just knew it. Behind the smile, though, I could hear sadness in her voice. He's gone and talked himself into it. Now what am I going to do without you, honey? I had thoughts about this late into the night, and an answer had come to me. A wonderful answer. Oh, I told her, you'll soon be coming to Oregon, too, just as you did to Arkansas. Grandma's thin arms tightened around me. I nestled my head into that comfortable space between her neck and soft cheeks, as I had so many times before. In the silence, the ticking of the clock on the wall was like both our hearts beating. Then Grandma gave me a long sigh. Perhaps so, child, she said softly. Perhaps so. She had to come, I thought afterward. I couldn't imagine being without Grandma. She had taken care of me most of the first 7 years of my life. My mother had died when I was just 9 months old, and Father had carried me a long, long way on horseback through the snow to Grandma's house. Everyone said I was too young to remember that journey, but sometimes I thought I did. Father's breath in the frosty air, snowflakes swirling around us, whitening the horse's dark mane, a startled rabbit hopping across the path. A few months later, Father married my mother's sister, but soon after Lavinia was born, his wife died also. So Grandma had raised my sister and me until the time, 2 years ago, when he married his third wife, Angelina Tate. As hard as I tried, I could not remember my own mother. All I knew about her was that Grandma had told me. She was a little bit of a thing, Grandma used to say, no bigger than a pint of cider, but lovely. Oh my, did she love to sing, and her hair was just the color of a copper penny. I wish that I had copper-colored hair too, but mine was ordinary brown like Father's. Still, I was fond of singing. And then there was a time when Lavinia and I were playing some games, and we got to laughing so we couldn't stop. All at once, I noticed Grandma staring at me, tears shining in her eyes. What's wrong, Grandma? I asked anxiously. Nothing is wrong, she answered, quickly dabbing her eyes. It's just that you have your mother's smile. That made two things I had of hers, her smile and her love of singing. Father never wanted to talk about my mother. It was Grandma who had given me the picture of her, hazy as it was, that I carried around in my head. Without Grandma, I wouldn't have known her at all. Father had to trade in town for a large sturdy wagon with a canvas cover and 8 strong oxen to pull it. We would also need a tent for sleeping, harness, bridles, and saddles for the horses, a gun, and many tools. Then there were all the provisions for a long journey, food, clothing, medicine, extra parts for the wagons. Besides all this, Father had to make yokes and pins and bows for hitching up the oxen and a heavy driving whip. I watched as he filled a long, slim bag, narrow at one end with shot. Carefully, he wove narrow strips of rawhide around it and added heavy handle with lashes. Then he cracked it. Standing against the barn, it sounded like the shot of a gun. May I try it? I asked. But when he put the whip in my hand with its thick handle and lashes longer than the height of a man, I could barely lift it. Father smiled as I handed it back to him. Takes practice, he said. In the meantime, Mother was packing the churned butter and homemade soap into pottery jars. She wrapped other provisions in sacks or poured them into jars, flour, cornmeal, rice, beans, sugar, salt, coffee, tea, dried fruit, molasses, lard, bacon, hams. When she was not readying the food supply, she was busy spinning and weaving strong cloth and making it up into clothing for the journey. I helped her out, 2 pairs of pants for Father, and at night she stitched them by the fire. What can we take with us, Lavinia and I asked one morning. Mother thought for a moment. If each of you would like to make a reticule, she suggested, you could fill them, and we will try to find a corner somewhere in the wagon for them. So Lavinia and I set to work sewing 2 little cloth bags with drawstring tops. Inside we put them a few small toys, like our dolls with the carved wooden heads, and little pottery play dishes that Father had made. There were also compartments for needles and thread and leftover scraps of fabric we were sewing into quilt squares. I already had 10 squares finished in the 9-patch pattern that Grandma had taught me, and Lavinia was just starting hers. And Grandma gave each of us a new thimble. On March 3rd, my 9th birthday, a brand new wagon with red wheels sat outside our front yard. Although the day was drizzly and cold, Lavinia and I rushed outside to see it. The wagon looked tall and roomy with the hickory bows that would hold the canvas cover in place, curving high over the top. Father lifted us up, and the two of us sat side by side on the spring seat. As we sat there, our journey suddenly seemed real to me. For the first time, I felt a little prickle of excitement. We're going to Oregon, I told Lavinia, cracking a pretend whip over the head of the pretend oxen. Gee-haw! Father laughed. It won't be long now, he said. Our departure was set for the beginning of April. Mother was worried about leaving so early, since this was the time the worst storms out in the plains. But so many people were going west this spring of 1852, Father had heard. If we left later, there might not be enough grass for our animals to graze on. It was better to risk storms than famine. Storms? Famine? When I heard those words, my mind clouded over again with doubts. We would be all alone out on those plains. Just one small family in one wagon. Back in the fall, when Father had first spoken of going to Oregon, many others, like Cousin Fred and Mr. Pritchard, had talked about going too. But as the months went by, little by little, they had changed their minds. Of course, Father said we would be safe, and armed with our guidebook and a good dose of common sense, and I trusted Father completely. I wanted to do what would make him happy. Then why was it that I still felt so reluctant to leave? Mother had a little flower garden next to the front door. Sometimes when her critical eye decided that their colors clashed, she would dig up one or another and move it to a different spot. Some of the plants popped right out of the ground, but others seemed anchored where they were, clinging with tiny curling root fingers to their small piece of earth. Maybe it was like one of those plants, I thought, holding fast to home. I thought of Grandma. She would not have hesitated a minute, I knew. She had married at 14, leaving her father's farm in Pennsylvania and going off to settle into the wilderness of Indiana. You wouldn't know it to look at her. She was so tiny and frail looking, like a gust of wind could blow her away. But Grandma was strong. With Grandpa, she had chopped down trees to build a log cabin. In it had raised 8 children. She could paddle a canoe, shoot a rifle as well as any man, she always said proudly. One time when Grandpa was away, she shot a panther out of a tree. Another time an Indian tried to steal a ham from up in the cabin rafters. I was stirring a kettle of hot cornmeal mush when I saw him, said Grandma, her blue eyes dancing when she told the story. I just snatched up my wooden spoon out of the kettle and applied it to that Indian's backside. He left mighty quick, I can tell you. After that, Grandpa died, when she still had the 5 youngest to raise. Grandma had moved to town and opened a grocery store. Oh, how I wished I was a little more like Grandma. While I thought and worried about the preparations for our journey went on, the new bright white canvas cover was stretched over the bows of the wagon. Then the packing began. The wagon had high boards on its side, making it nearly 4 feet deep. Father divided the space into 2 stories. On the bottom went everything we would not be using every day, like the huge sacks of flour, medicines, extra clothing, and dishes and wagon parts. This was carefully leveled. Then a strong piece of canvas was stretched over it, making kind of a second floor. On top of this were placed all the things we would be needing on a daily use, neatly rolled and bundled. Father made a wooden grub box with a lid for food that sat in the front of the wagon, with the cooking pots wrapped snugly in sacks. An outside box was attached to the wagon for halters, hobbles, ropes, chains, axe, shovel, hammer, and other tools, and there was a rack for Father's gun. One morning while I was watching Father repair a harness in the barn, another of our neighbors came to speak to him. It was John Ragsdale's mother, a small, faded-looking woman with a whispery voice. Please, she begged Father, you must take John with you. Father hesitated, looking at her. I could certainly use his help with the animals, he agreed, but are you sure? If he goes, there is no telling when you may see him again. I held my breath, hoping she would say yes. It wasn't surprising that John would want to go with us. We had taken him a year ago because his stepfather was cruel to him. With 6 younger children to care for, including a new baby, his weary mother had nowhere else to turn. Father and Mother were fond of John. I knew, and there was something about his teasing ways that always cheered me. It would make a difference to all of us to have him along. His mother's flushed face seemed barely able to hold in her feelings, but she nodded firmly. He wants to go. Then we'll take him, Father promised. Now the time was growing near. The wagon had been pulled up close to the house for final packing. Many of our neighbors gathered around to watch. Mother kept thinking of one more thing that just had to go. A few pieces of good blue and white china that had belonged to her mother. Some pretty tablecloths. A quart of wild plum preserves. There were the books. I could not do without Father's Bible, a volume of Robert Burns' poetry, and one of Longfellow's, Webster's Elementary Speller, and a third reader, so Lavinia and I could have lessons along the way. And the wooden washtub, a big brass kettle, and a rolled-up feather ticks that we would sleep on. As I handed them up one by one to Father, I thought they were like birds building a nest. At last Father fastened a small water keg to the side of the wagon, with a gourd dipper hanging beside it. He tied our two splint-bottom easy chairs to the back, and hung the tar buckets for greasing the wheels underneath. We were ready to leave the following morning. I found it hard to fall asleep at night, while Lavinia sighed with the sleeping kitten in the bed beside me. I lay stiff as a log, my eyes staring up into the darkness. All sorts of strange visions danced around in my brain. Painted Indian faces turned into Grandma's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Hen's eggs filled into the sky, changed into snow, and piled into our wagon. But despite all my fears, I knew nothing could keep us from making this journey now. Finally, with the words, "We're going to Oregon, we're going to Oregon," repeating over and over in my ears, I fell into an exhausted sleep. Then suddenly it was morning, a bright sunny spring day, and Mother was calling us. "Mary Ellen, Lavinia, come and help." We hurried through breakfast. I helped Mother pack up our lunch in a basket. Then Lavinia and I went outside to hand up the last of the cooking pots and our quilts, feather pillows to Father. Mother was busy sweeping the empty house to leave it tidy for a family to whom we have sold it. Meanwhile, relatives and friends were arriving to say goodbye. "Go and ask Mother if she has anything else to go in the wagon." I walked to the open door. Mother had finished sweeping. The straw broom leaned against the wall next to the fireplace. That a bare china cupboard was too heavy to take with us was the only thing left in the room that had always seemed crowded with furnishings. I looked at the fireplace, neatly swept out, and the places where our two easy chairs had sat. The outline of the hearth rug still showed on the dark plank floors, worn smooth by the tread of many feet. The room felt strange to me, empty and cold. Mother appeared, taking off her apron. "Father wants to know if there's anything else for the wagon." "Just these." Mother held up a wooden spoon and a folded paper of her flower seeds. For a moment neither of us moved. I stared around the room, trying to memorize it, not as though looking now, but as it used to be. Though Mother said nothing, I thought maybe she was doing the same. "Well, Father is waiting." Our footsteps made a hollow sound as we walked to the door. I didn't look back when Mother latched it. Father had sent John to gather up the animals. There were 4 pairs of oxen, 2 milk cows named Lily and Blackie, and our tame little heifer, Daisy. Lavinia and I begged Father to take her along. At last he had agreed. Then there were Father's 2 horses, Polly and Pet, and our watchdog, Rover. The oxen were soon hitched up to the wagon, and Polly was saddled for John to ride. Father stood next to the team, his new whip ready in his hand. Still, he did not give the order to move out. We were being wrapped in hugs, covered with kisses, passed from one pair of arms to another. Cousin Fred nearly squeezed my breath away. Then came Cousin Martha and the minister's wife and Great Aunt Harriet. "You'll be a good girl, won't you, Mary Ellen, and take care of your little sisters?" "Oh, I just know we'll never see you again," someone wailed. Cousin Will tickled me with his beard and then passed me to Mrs. Pritchard, who enfolded me with her plump arms. "Keep up your courage," I heard the tall, pale young minister saying to Mother. "Whatever happens, don't fret. Courage will do more for you than anything else." John's mother and younger sisters hovered over him. Even George Kimball, as worried-looking as ever, was giving Father some last-minute warning. Finally I came to Grandma. "Oh, honey, honey," was all she could say to me, but her bright blue eyes shining. "Remember," I told her fiercely, "you'll soon be coming to Oregon, too." Grandma did not answer, just held me close for a long time, and I felt tears falling on my hair. Slowly we climbed into the wagon underneath that clean white canvas cover. Mother was crying softly. Lavinia and Cynthia looked scared. Finally, Father popped his whip. "Gee buck!" he shouted. The wheels began to turn, and the oxen moved toward the road. Looking back through the round gathering opening in the wagon cover, I saw all the familiar faces, some smiling, some tearful, the many waving hands. Grandma leaning on Cousin Will's arm, looking small and forlorn, her handkerchief clutched in one hand, the breeze ruffling her wisp of white hair. Suddenly I was filled with the most overwhelming sadness. Maybe it was true, I thought. Maybe we would never see any of those faces again, not even Grandma's. My eyes blurred with tears, and I couldn't help it. I put down my head and cried. When I finally was able to look back again, the faces had disappeared from sight. All I could see was the rutted dirt road, the pale green budding trees, and Rover, his white plume of tail waving, running alongside the wagon. The wheels rattled and creaked. Going to Oregon, they seemed to say. Going to Oregon.